I'll never forget the screech of metal like a bone snapping through skin when the crusher's jaws came down on my SUV. The HOA board stood off to the side, smug arms crossed, watching as if this was their coronation ceremony. My crime, refusing to hand over a stack of so-called late fees that even a Vegas slot machine would blush at. They thought I was just another homeowner too scared to fight back someone who'd beg pay up and keep quiet. But the truth, I was counting every second. I'd already planted the trackers, lined up the evidence, and made a few phone calls to some friends in very high places. Let them destroy my car. I was about to destroy their empire. Before we dive into this story, do me a favor, drop your city and local time in the comments. I want to see just how far this HOA madness reaches. When I first moved into Lakewood Pines, I thought I'd found a quiet slice of heaven. Picture it, a winding street wrapped around a man-made lake, ducks waddling along the shore, kids biking without helmets, like it was still the 80 seconds, and lawns so aggressively green they looked photoshopped. The real estate agent pitched it as a community of shared values. What she didn't say was that those values were written in all caps by an HOA board that treated bylaws like scripture and violations like the 10 Commandments of Doom. Within a week of unpacking, I learned who was really in charge. Her name was Marlene Voss, the HOA president, a woman who had mastered the art of weaponizing a clipboard. Tall, thin, permanently pursed lips, and hair sprayed into submission, she gave off the aura of someone who had spent years teaching middle school, but finally found a kingdom where no one could talk back. If Marlene spotted a dandelion in your yard, she'd circle it in red pen, staple it to your front door, and call it a community hazard. Her right-hand man was Glenn the treasurer. Imagine a bean counter who took one accounting class in college but never got over the thrill of balancing a checkbook. He spoke in numbers, fees, and penalties, and he always had a faint sheen of sweat, as if the weight of all those dollar signs was too much for his pores. Then there was Duke, the so-called security contractor. Duke had the build of a retired linebacker and the brain power of an unplugged toaster. His company's logo was a wolf baring its teeth, but in reality, his job was to slap neon boots on people's cars and mutter threats about compliance. I tried to keep my head down. After all, I wasn't here to stir trouble. I'd done my time in cities where you locked your doors and prayed your neighbor didn't steal your Amazon packages. This place was supposed to be peaceful, a place where I could grill steaks without worrying about drive-bys. But peace doesn't last long when you're under Marlene's microscope. The first notice arrived 3 days after I moved in. A bright orange slip taped to my garage door. Trash cans must be flush with curb not angled. My cans had been off by maybe 10 inches. I thought it was a joke, some kind of quirky neighborhood hazing. But when I peeled the slip off, I noticed it was carbon copied. Marlene kept a copy for her files. That was my first taste of the paper trail she built like a spider weaving a web. The second notice came a week later, vehicle parked within 12 inches of crosswalk. I measured it myself. 11.5 inches. I laughed, shook my head, and tossed the notice in the recycling. My mistake. 2 days later, Glenn mailed me an invoice for $75, marked administrative fine. By the end of the first month, I had 4 notices pinned to my fridge like trophies. Lawn edging, not uniform. Hose left coiled in unsightly position. License plate dirty. Each one carried a fine, small at first, but they stacked faster than unpaid bar tabs in Vegas. My neighbors whispered warnings as I walked the dog. Just pay them, one woman told me. It's not worth the hassle. Another admitted she'd once been fined $200 for putting up Christmas lights too early. That's when I realized this wasn't about community standards. It was about control and money. Most people folded under the pressure. They'd cut a check, slip it into the HOA mailbox, and hope Marlene's clipboard moved on to the next victim. But I don't do fold. Not in my line of work. Instead, I started documenting everything. Dates, times, wording of the notices, even the brand of pen Marlene used when she scribbled those red circles on infractions. I wanted a record, because if you've ever worked investigations, you know that paper trails don't just tell stories, they expose patterns. It didn't take long to see the pattern here. Every violation escalated to a fee. Every fee had to be paid by cash or cashier's check. No electronic payments, no credit cards, no audit trail. Glenn insisted it was for security reasons. Right. The kind of security that kept his pockets lined and the residents too scared to question it. One night, I watched from my window as Duke slapped a boot on my neighbor's Honda. The poor guy, Mr. Patel, pleaded from his porch in his pajamas. He had tears in his eyes as he handed Duke an envelope of cash. Duke didn't even give him a receipt, just ripped the boot off, muttered something about, "Consider this a warning," and walked away. That was the moment I knew this wasn't incompetence. It was extortion with paperwork. I kept my cool, though. Let them think I was another pushover. I even smiled politely when Marlene cornered me during the next community meeting where she lectured about maintaining property values. Her eyes lingered on me, as if daring me to challenge her authority. I didn't, not yet. Instead, I walked back to my house, sat at my desk, and opened a fresh notebook. On the first page, I wrote 3 names in block letters: Marlene, Glenn, Duke. Then I underlined them twice. Because if there's one thing I've learned in this life, it's that every empire, no matter how small or petty, eventually collapses. All you need is the right lever. And I was already searching for it. If the orange slips on my garage door were meant to break me in gently, the final notice felt like a sucker punch. It arrived on a Tuesday morning in a plain white envelope slipped under my doormat. Bold black letters screamed across the top: refusal to pay fees. Delinquent Akani. According to Glenn's math, I now owed $450 in administrative fines, plus a $125 late processing fee. The kicker: they claimed my trash cans had been angled improperly again. I hadn't even put them out that week. That was the moment I stopped laughing. Up until then, I'd treated Marlene's little war as neighborhood theater, annoying sure, but almost cartoonish in its absurdity. But accusing me of refusing to pay when I'd never missed a deadline? That was fraud, plain and simple. And if there's one thing I can't stand, it's someone trying to launder extortion through official-looking paperwork. I called the HOA office number listed at the bottom of the letter, straight to voicemail. I left a message demanding copies of the board's vote authorizing these fees, the bylaws supporting them, and a full financial audit. 24 hours later, a new slip appeared on my garage: communications harassment, $50. They had the gall to fine me for asking questions. That's when I knew this wasn't just a racket, it was a system. That night I sat on my porch with a notebook and a mug of black coffee. One by one, neighbors drifted past, avoiding eye contact like we were prisoners in the same camp. I broke the silence with a question. You ever been fined for something you didn't do? The first to crack was Linda, 2 houses down. She leaned in and whispered like we were trading state secrets. Last Christmas, I got a $200 fine for putting lights up too early. They said it created a visual hazard. My husband wanted to fight it, but she trailed off, her voice catching. They threatened to revoke our pool key. Next came the Petersons' teenagers in tow. Their son had left a skateboard on the lawn one afternoon. Marlene wrote it up as improper storage of recreational equipment. A $100 fine. When Mr. Peterson tried to dispute it at the monthly meeting, Duke escorted him out. By midnight, I had a list of grievances that read like a rap sheet: false violations, arbitrary fines, threats of losing community privileges. And the worst part: every payment went through Glenn either in cash or cashier's checks. No receipts unless you begged, no electronic records. Just a black hole of fees that disappeared into a slush fund. I decided to test the system. The next morning, I deliberately parked my car half an inch over the white line in my driveway. Sure enough, by 6:00 a.m., a fresh notice fluttered under my wiper: improper parking. $100. Duke's truck rumbled off down the street, his brake lights glowing like the devil's eyes. I filed a formal dispute. I cited state statutes, requested a hearing, even referenced the HOA bylaws that specifically exempted minor parking deviations. The reply: a curt email from Marlene. Your behavior constitutes obstruction. Fees are non-negotiable. Continued resistance will result in further action. Further action came that Friday night. I woke to the sound of chains clanking outside. Peering through the blinds, I saw Duke hooking my SUV to a tow truck. I stormed outside, paperwork in hand, shouting about my dispute filing. He smirked, spit on the pavement, and said, "Board says you're delinquent. Pay or lose the ride." I watched as my vehicle disappeared into the darkness. By Saturday morning, it was gone. No trace at the impound lot, no official record of the tow. That was the moment it hit me. This wasn't incompetence, and it wasn't just greed. It was organized theft. They'd perfected the art of turning community enforcement into a cash cow. I started digging deeper. At the county clerk's office, I checked the certified mail logs the HOA claimed they'd sent. Half of them didn't exist. The proof of mailing they'd attached to fines recycled postage labels with mismatched dates. In the world of federal law, that's not a minor slip-up, that's mail fraud. I snapped photos, filed copies, built a timeline. Each piece of evidence slotted into place like a jigsaw puzzle, and the picture that emerged was damning fake notices to justify fake fines enforced by Duke's tow company funneled through Glenn's accounting games. On Sunday, I found my SUV again sitting in a fenced yard behind an auto shop that just happened to be owned by Duke's cousin. A bright yellow sticker slapped across the windshield read, "Forfeit to be liquidated." I could have stormed the office right then, demanded my keys, maybe even called the sheriff. But that wasn't my style. Not yet. Instead, I took a step back, snapped a dozen photos, and let the scene burn into my memory. If they wanted to play dirty, I'd let them bury themselves first. Because what Marlene and her cronies didn't know was that every letter, every forged stamp, every false fine wasn't just harassment, it was a federal crime. And me, I wasn't just some homeowner. I was the wrong target for the right scam. And I was about to make them regret every single orange slip. Most people, when they discover their car has been hauled away and marked for liquidation, panic. They call the sheriff, they scream at the tow company, maybe they even try to break into the yard to reclaim what's theirs. Me, I made coffee. I sat at my kitchen table, poured it black, and opened my notebook. Because the truth was, I didn't want to save my SUV, I wanted to sacrifice it. You see, in law enforcement, there's something called letting the crime mature. You don't bust in at the first whiff of wrongdoing. You let the crooks get comfortable, overconfident, sloppy. And HOA Marlene was nothing if not overconfident. On Monday morning, I drove my backup sedan down to the yard. Through the chain-link fence, I watched as a crane hoisted my SUV like it was nothing more than scrap. Its tires dangled in the air, still muddy from last week's rain. The operator guided it onto the conveyor belt of the crusher. The jaws opened like some prehistoric beast ready to devour. And then, crunch. The metal folded in on itself, glass popping like gunfire, the sound echoing across the lot. My chest tightened, but not from grief. From satisfaction. Because I had a tracker hidden in the glove box, a micro body cam wedged behind the rearview mirror, and a tiny GPS transmitter embedded in the bumper. Even in death, my car was testifying. I recorded the entire process from the sidewalk timestamp and all. Duke was there, clipboard in hand, joking with the operator about how much cash they'd get for the scrap weight. He signed off on the destruction as HOA authorized. That phrase alone was worth gold in court. The funny thing about criminals is they always think they're being discreet. But the louder the crusher roared, the more neighbors peeked out from their porches. By the time my SUV was reduced to a cube of twisted metal, I had 3 separate cell phone videos texted to me by residents who couldn't believe what they were witnessing. The HOA wasn't just breaking rules, they were breaking trust, and people were starting to realize it. That evening, I paid a visit to someone I'd heard whispers about, Sandra Collins, the former treasurer. She lived 2 streets over in a modest ranch house, the kind with peeling shutters and a yard she didn't bother manicuring anymore. When she opened the door, her eyes darted nervously. "If this is about the board, I'm done," she said. I smiled. "Then you'll be glad to know I'm not." Sandra let me in. Over cups of chamomile tea, she told me her story. She'd quit after questioning why so much of the HOA budget was earmarked for vehicle enforcement. Every time she asked to see receipts, Glenn would stonewall her. The final straw came when she noticed deposits into a mysterious LLC account money that should have gone to community projects. When she pressed, Marlene accused her of financial misconduct and forced her resignation. "Do you still have any records?" I asked. Sandra hesitated, then disappeared into the back room. She returned with a folder stuffed with photocopies, ledger pages, check images, even emails Glenn had accidentally CC'd to her. As I flipped through the scheme, crystallized violation fees funneled through the HOA account, kicked out to Glenn's LLC, then bled into Duke's tow company. It wasn't just unethical. It was textbook racketeering. I thanked her, promised confidentiality, and slipped the folder into my bag. Back at home, I spread everything out across my dining table. Photos of my crushed SUV, copies of fraudulent notices, Sandra's ledger pages, video clips from neighbors. Together they told a story so tight not even Marlene's hairspray could hold it together. The next step was getting law enforcement involved. And here's where I had an advantage. I wasn't just some angry homeowner with a grudge, I was a federal agent with a Rolodex full of people who owed me favors. I made 3 phone calls. The first to the local postal inspector because mail fraud was already on the table. The second to the U.S. Attorney's Office flagging potential wire fraud and extortion under color of law. And the third to the county sheriff's task force, the boots on the ground I'd need for the takedown. But I didn't want a messy raid. I wanted a clean sting. To get that, I needed them to take one more step, something undeniable. So I baited the hook. The following week, I attended the special compliance hearing Marlene had scheduled just for me. It was held in the community center, fluorescent lights buzzing overhead, folding chairs arranged in a semicircle like a courtroom run by amateurs. Marlene sat at the head table, Glenn beside her, Duke looming in the corner like an unpaid bouncer. "You are hereby notified." Marlene began adjusting her glasses that your continued refusal to pay HOA fees constitutes grounds for property liens and forfeiture of privileges. I put on my best poker face. "Suppose I just bring cash. Would that make this all go away?" Her eyes gleamed. "That would be acceptable." "Bingo." I nodded slowly, pretending defeat. "Fine, but I'll need a few days." As I walked out, Duke muttered, "Make sure it's cash. None of that paper trail crap." Exactly what I wanted him to say. At home, I pulled out a cashier's check I'd already arranged with the bank. Serial numbers documented, marked bills attached, all of it traceable. When the time came, I'd hand it over and let them dig their own grave. Because this wasn't just about my crushed SUV anymore. This was about dismantling a system of extortion masquerading as community enforcement. And the deeper I dug, the clearer it became. Marlene's empire was nothing more than a house of cards. And I was about to blow on it. The thing about crooks in suits, or in this case crooks with clipboards, is that they crave validation. They want to believe you've surrendered, that you've finally realized resistance is futile. That's why when I told Marlene I'd bring cash, her eyes glittered like Christmas lights on a power surge. To her, it wasn't just money. It was proof of dominance. I spent the next few days preparing my bait. At the bank, I arranged for a cashier's check marked with a unique serial number. I also requested a bundle of marked bills, each bill's serial logged with the Treasury database. Both items went into a plain white envelope, unassuming to the eye, but a grenade with the pin pulled. Meanwhile, I wired up my car with hidden cameras, a button cam on my jacket, a pen recorder in my breast pocket. Even my watch doubled as a body cam. If I was going to walk into their den, I wanted every smirk, every slip of the tongue, every wink-wink on tape. The hearing was scheduled for Thursday evening, but before then, I did more homework. At the county clerk's office, I pulled up the HOA's vendor contracts. There it was in black and white. Duke's Tow Company had been awarded a sole source contract without competitive bidding. The justification, emergency enforcement capabilities. In reality, it was a blank check. The invoices billed the HOA for removal services, each conveniently rounded to the nearest 100. Then I dug into property records. Guess who owned the parcel where my SUV had been crushed? Not Duke's cousin as I thought, but Glenn himself through another LLC. It was a self-feeding machine. Marlene signed off violations, Duke enforced them. Glenn collected the spoils. A neat little triangle of fraud. I brought these findings to Sandra, the former treasurer. She almost cried when she saw the paper trail confirming what she'd suspected all along. "They've been stealing from all of us," she whispered, clutching the ledgers like they were poisoned. "Correction," I said. "They've been stealing." Past tense. Thursday arrived. I walked into the community hall wearing jeans and a flannel, looking like a beaten-down homeowner ready to cave. The folding chairs were half full, with curious neighbors whispering about what was going to happen. Marlene sat at the front table, pearls glinting under the fluorescent lights. Glenn tapped nervously at his calculator. Duke leaned against the wall, arms crossed, radiating his usual blend of cheap cologne and menace. "Mr. Walker," Marlene said, her tone dripping with faux professionalism, "do you have the payment we requested?" I pulled the envelope from my pocket and placed it gently on the table. Her eyes darted to it like a hawk spotting prey. "This should clear everything up, right?" I asked, feigning resignation. "Indeed," Glenn muttered, sliding the envelope closer. He peeked inside his pupils, dilating at the sight of crisp bills and an official check. "Just to confirm," I said, raising my voice enough for the room to hear, "this payment will make all my violations disappear." Marlene's lips curled. "As long as you remain cooperative, yes." Click. My pen recorder captured it. My watch lens caught her smirk. The walls were closing in and they didn't even realize it. Duke, never one for subtlety, leaned forward and growled, "Next time, don't make us chase you this hard. You pay when we tell you to pay." "Got it." I nodded slowly, hiding my satisfaction. That single line was worth more than gold. It was a confession wrapped in bravado. After the meeting, I walked out into the humid night air, neighbors parting like I carried the plague. They didn't know yet, but they just witnessed the end of the HOA's reign. Because as soon as I stepped into my car, I forwarded the footage to the postal inspector, the U.S. Attorney's Office, and the Sheriff's Task Force. The responses came fast. "This is enough to secure warrants," the inspector said. The AUSA agreed. Extortion under color of authority, conspiracy, mail fraud, wire fraud. The list was long enough to keep Marlene and her crew busy for decades. Still, I wasn't satisfied. I wanted them nailed to the wall so thoroughly that no slick lawyer could wriggle them free. So I baited them again. The next morning, I called Glenn directly. "Hey, I'm a little nervous about last night. Could we maybe do future payments in cash? No checks." He hesitated, then said, "That would be preferable, yes. Preferable. Perfect." I arranged a drop for the following week at the community center parking lot. Plain sight, broad daylight, no excuses. Every agency I'd looped in set up surveillance, hidden vans, long lenses, even a drone buzzing quietly above. When the day came, I pulled up in my sedan envelope in hand. Glenn waddled over, sweat staining his collar. Duke lingered nearby, trying to look casual but failing miserably. I handed over the envelope. He slipped it into his briefcase without a word. That was it. The deal was sealed. The marked bills were in his possession. The cashier's check with traceable serials now sat in his file, and every second of it was recorded from 3 angles. I didn't blow my cover just yet. I let them walk away smug and satisfied. Let them think they'd won. Because the longer they believed in their invincibility, the harder the fall would hit. Back home, I leaned against the kitchen counter, sipped a cold beer, and smiled. The trap was set. The jaws were closing. And this time, it wouldn't be my SUV getting crushed. The envelope drop should have been enough. Any sane crook would have backed off, laid low, maybe even skipped town. But Marlene wasn't sane. She was drunk on power, addicted to the taste of control like it was fine wine. That's why just 3 days after Glenn pocketed the marked bills, I received another notice taped to my door. Mandatory special meeting compliance hearing for homeowner Walker. The words were typed in bold, framed by the HOA logo like an official summons. They wanted to humiliate me one last time, parade me in front of the neighborhood as an example of what happens when you defy their authority. Perfect. Thursday evening, I walked into the community hall with my head high and my jacket wired. The air smelled of mildew and folding chairs. About 40 residents sat scattered across the room, most of them avoiding my gaze. At the front table, Marlene sat like a queen behind her throne, pearls gleaming lipstick sharp enough to cut glass. Glenn shuffled papers nervously, while Duke leaned in the corner, arms folded, eyes scanning the room for a fight. "Mr. Walker," Marlene began, her voice amplified by a cheap microphone. "We are convened to address your continued delinquency, disruptive behavior, and harassment of the board." I raised an eyebrow. Harassment. All I did was ask where the money's going. A ripple of whispers ran through the room. Marlene's smile tightened. "The details of HOA finances are not for residents to scrutinize. That responsibility lies with elected leadership. And you have shown nothing but disrespect for that leadership." Glenn chimed in, voice trembling. "You owe substantial fees. We have the right to place a lien on your property. If you do not comply, we will escalate." "Escalate how?" I asked. That's when Duke pushed off the wall, cracking his knuckles. "We've got ways of making people cooperate. You already lost your car. Next time it won't be just a vehicle." The audience gasped. Some covered their mouths, others stared wide-eyed. And I couldn't have scripted it better if I'd tried. My jacket mic caught every syllable crystal clear. I leaned back in my chair, forcing a smirk. "So let me get this straight. You're threatening to destroy more of my property unless I hand over money in cash. No receipts, no records." Marlene snapped. "That is not what was said." "Oh, it's exactly what was said," I replied loud enough for everyone to hear. "And just to be clear, you authorized my car to be crushed without due process." "Because you were delinquent," she barked, face flushing crimson. Glenn tugged at his collar, sweat beading. Duke growled something unintelligible. The room buzzed with tension. Neighbors exchanged uneasy looks. For the first time, cracks appeared in the facade of control. And then, like clockwork, my phone buzzed in my pocket, a discreet signal. The task force was ready. I stood straight in my jacket and looked each of them in the eye. "You've made this very easy for me, because every threat, every word, every dollar you pocketed has been documented. And guess what? You picked the wrong guy to shake down." Marlene sneered. "And who exactly do you think you are?" That was the cue. I pulled my badge from my pocket, held it high for the whole room to see. The golden eagle caught the flickering fluorescent light. Gasps rippled through the hall. "My name is Walker, federal agent." Chaos erupted. Chairs screeched. Glenn dropped his papers, his face draining of color. Duke lunged forward, but before he could reach me, the doors burst open. Sheriff's deputies flooded in, followed by 2 postal inspectors and a pair of men in suits from the U.S. Attorney's office. Radios crackled, cuffs clicked, commands barked. Hands where we can see them. Neighbors pressed back against the walls as law enforcement swarmed the room. Duke tried to run only to be tackled by 2 deputies. Glenn stammered excuses, waving his hands helplessly. Marlene stayed, frozen lips trembling, the clipboard clutched in her hands like a shield. "This is outrageous," she screeched as agents pried the clipboard from her fingers. "You can't do this. This is private property." One of the inspectors stepped forward. "Ma'am, you are under investigation for mail fraud, wire fraud, extortion, conspiracy, and racketeering. You have the right to remain silent." The color drained completely from her face. I watched it unfold with a strange calm. Weeks of harassment fines, notices, threats, all culminating in this moment. The self-proclaimed queen of Lakewood Pines dethroned in front of her subjects. And the best part, it wasn't me who destroyed her. It was her own arrogance, her own greed, her own words. Neighbors began whispering louder now, no longer fearful. "I knew it," one muttered. "She fined me for weeds," another said. The tide had turned. As Glenn was let out in cuffs, he muttered, "It was just business." "No," I said, stepping closer so only he could hear. "This was extortion, and you got caught." By the time the last of them were loaded into patrol cars, the community hall was buzzing with something I hadn't felt here before: hope. People stood taller, voices firmer, like a spell had been broken. I tucked my badge away, turned to the crowd, and said, "Your HOA isn't above the law. Remember that." And with that, I walked out into the night, the sirens fading behind me. The trap had sprung. The empire had collapsed. But the story wasn't over yet. The night of the special meeting ended with Marlene, Glenn, and Duke in cuffs. But that was only half the story. You don't dismantle an empire by arresting its generals. You burn down the supply lines, the money channels, the dirty infrastructure that keeps the whole thing breathing. That's why while I was standing in that community hall holding my badge up for everyone to see, another team was moving in on the scrapyard where my SUV had been crushed. It was 7:02 p.m. when the warrants dropped. Deputies rolled into the yard in unmarked trucks, headlights cutting through the dusk. The crusher still sat there, jaws stained with the grease and dust of 100 vehicles, maybe more. The operator froze mid-step when he saw the deputies fan out, weapons ready. One postal inspector carried a thick stack of paperwork, subpoenas, seizure orders, every formality wrapped in ironclad legality. They didn't just seize the crusher, they seized the office trailer, the computer drives, the handwritten ledgers stuffed in a file cabinet that smelled of gasoline. In those ledgers, page after page listed violations tied to plate numbers, vehicle descriptions, and cash payments. Some cars had been destroyed without any record of lien, no legal authority whatsoever. It wasn't enforcement, it was theft disguised as policy. And then came the real jackpot. Inside a safe, the task force discovered envelopes of cash bound with rubber bands, each one labeled with initials. MV for Marlene Voss, GS for Glenn, DR for Duke. They didn't even bother to hide it. Arrogance makes criminals sloppy, and these three were Olympic champions of arrogance. Meanwhile, back in the hall, I walked among the stunned residents. Some were crying with relief, others muttering in disbelief. For years, they'd been told resistance was pointless, that the board had the power to crush them literally. Now they were watching the board being loaded into cruisers like petty street hustlers. Marlene spat curses at me as deputies pushed her outside. "You'll regret this. You don't know who you're dealing with." I leaned close enough that only she could hear. "On the contrary, I know exactly who I've been dealing with, and now the whole country will too." The next morning, the story broke wide. Local news vans lined the entrance of Lakewood Pines. Reporters shoved microphones in residents' faces. Words like scandal, racketeering, and federal charges scrolled across television tickers. Drone footage showed deputies hauling box after box of records out of the HOA office. But my favorite moment came at noon when the U.S. Attorney held a press conference. He stood behind a podium, flanked by agents, and announced indictments on more than a dozen counts: mail fraud, wire fraud, extortion, under color of law, conspiracy, and racketeering. The penalties stacked up like bricks, decades in federal prison if convicted. Footage from the scrapyard raid ran side by side with clips from the community hall sting. Duke's threats, Marlene's smirks, Glenn pocketing the envelope, it all played on repeat, evidence so damning it might as well have been a confession. My neighbors watched slack-jawed as the empire crumbled in real time. For the first time, I saw something other than fear in their eyes: gratitude, relief, vindication. Later that day, Sandra knocked on my door. She stood there holding the ledger copies she'd given me weeks earlier. "I never thought anyone would listen," she said, her voice trembling. "Thank you for proving I wasn't crazy." "You weren't crazy," I told her. "You were brave." Word spread fast that the HOA board had been dissolved by court order. A financial trustee was appointed to manage the association until a new election could be held. Every lien, every fine, every bogus violation was frozen pending review. Residents who'd been milk dry for years finally had hope of restitution. But for me, the victory wasn't about money, it was about exposure. Karen-style dictatorships like Marlene's thrive in the shadows, hidden behind jargon and clipboards. Once dragged into the light, they collapse under the weight of their own absurdity. That night I sat on my porch as the sun bled into the lake, watching the neighborhood come alive again. Kids played without parents, yelling about fines. Neighbors waved hesitant at first, then with genuine warmth. The fear was gone. Still, I couldn't help one last walk down to the scrapyard. Deputies had left tape across the gate, the crusher, now silent jaws locked open like a defeated beast. Behind the fence sat a twisted cube of metal, what used to be my SUV. I stared at it, the mangled steel glinting in the floodlights. It was useless now, but it had served its purpose. A reporter spotted me and asked, "How does it feel to see your car like that?" I smiled. "Worth every dent. Because sometimes you have to let them crush your car to crush their empire." The fall of Marlene and her cronies didn't just end in abusive HOA reign, it rewired the soul of Lakewood Pines. In the weeks after the arrests, the community looked like a neighborhood trying to remember what normal felt like. Gone were the neon violation slips fluttering like scarlet letters on garage doors. Gone were Duke's boots clamped onto cars like trophies of intimidation. For the first time since I moved in, people actually smiled at each other on morning walks. A court-appointed trustee held a town hall under very different circumstances. This time, the folding chairs weren't arranged like a courtroom. They were set in a circle, equal footing, no head table lording over the rest. Residents spoke up timidly at first, then louder, as they realized nobody was going to shut them down. They shared stories of humiliation, of sleepless nights over bogus fines, of paying cash under the table just to avoid Duke's knock at the door. The trustee assured them restitution claims would be processed. The slush funds Glenn had hidden would be audited. And most importantly, the bylaws would be rewritten. No more cash-only rules. No more arbitrary fines. No more unchecked authority. Transparency was no longer a suggestion, it was the law. Sandra, the former treasurer, was offered her position back. At first she declined, but then she looked around the room, saw her neighbors urging her on, and finally agreed. Her eyes glistened as she accepted, promising she'd run the finances like a church bake sale, every cookie accounted for. The room erupted in laughter and applause. As for me, I wasn't there to run for office. My job had been to expose, dismantle, and restore balance. Still, people treated me differently. Kids called me the FBI guy, though technically they weren't wrong. Neighbors dropped off casseroles, bottles of wine, even thank you notes slipped under my doormat. One evening, Mr. Patel, the man I'd seen paying Duke in his pajamas, brought me a plate of samosas and said, "You gave us our dignity back." That one hit harder than any medal. Of course, Marlene tried to fight back. From her jail cell, she filed a flurry of complaints, claiming political persecution, gender discrimination, even a wild conspiracy that I'd planted her clipboard with incriminating notes. None of it stuck. The evidence was airtight, the recordings damning the cash trail undeniable. She eventually cut a plea deal, throwing Glenn under the bus. Glenn tried to blame Duke. Duke predictably tried to fight the charges with fists, until a deputy reminded him what steel cuffs feel like. In the end, all three faced years behind bars. The crusher yard was seized and repurposed as a county impound lot. Every cube of mangled steel became Exhibit A in a gallery of corruption. My SUV still sits there folded like an accordion. I kept the photos. One day maybe I'll frame them. But the real transformation wasn't in court filings or prison sentences. It was in the way people carried themselves. Where once they whispered and avoided eye contact, now they waved shared gardening tips and organized block parties. The HOA, stripped of tyranny, became what it was supposed to be all along, a community. I like to think Marlene's empire fell not because of my badge, but because people finally saw the truth. Exposure, not revenge. That's what broke the spell. When the whole neighborhood witnessed the arrests, when the news cameras replayed Duke's threats and Glenn's sweaty palms clutching cash, the illusion of authority shattered. One evening, as I sat on my porch with a beer, a reporter called asking if I considered what happened revenge. I laughed. "No," I said. "Revenge is personal. This was justice. Big difference." The lake shimmered under the fading Sunday, kids splashed in the shallows, their parents cheering them on instead of scolding them about HOA rules. For the first time, Lakewood Pines looked like the paradise it had been advertised as. And I finally felt like I could breathe. Because sometimes you don't win by fighting every battle. You win by letting your enemies believe they've beaten you right up until the cuffs click. When I look back on it, all the crushed SUV, the orange slips, the endless threats, I don't see loss. I see clarity. The HOA thought power came from paper notices and intimidation. But real power comes from accountability, from shining light on corruption so everyone can see it for what it island. Life has a way of testing us with petty tyrants, people who mistake authority for license, who confuse bullying with leadership. You can't always fight them head on. Sometimes you let them push too far, expose themselves, and collapse under the weight of their own arrogance. That lesson doesn't just apply to HOAs, it applies to every workplace, every institution, every relationship where control tries to masquerade as order. If you take anything from my story, let it be this: don't let fear silence you. Document, stand your ground, and remember, bullies only win if you hand them the pen to write the rules. Now, I want to hear from you. Have you ever faced a Karen, an HOA, or any petty tyrant who thought they could crush you? Drop your story in the comments. And if you want more tales like this, subscribe to the channel. Trust me, you won't want to miss what happens next.